So here's what's going on. Europe is in a tough spot. They're being squeezed from every direction and now they have to make a choice. Either protect their own independence or keep following the US, even if it drags them down. Since the Biden administration came in, Europe has made some strange decisions, especially when it comes to China. They've slapped tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and solar panels, and now it looks like they're panicking. China has finally said, enough. In response, they just sanctioned 2 European banks, meaning those banks can't do business in China anymore. That's a big deal, because China is the largest economy in Asia. These sanctions are a warning shot. They're not hitting Europe's biggest banks yet, but they're showing what could happen if things continue. It all started when the EU sanctioned Chinese banks for doing business with Russia. Now it's tit for tat. The EU is being tested. Will they keep pushing or will they step back? Some countries, like Hungary and Spain, seem to want better ties with China. But overall, the US still has a tight grip on Europe. Even after Trump's trade war and high tariffs, Europe hasn't been able to break free. Take Italy as an example. Their government is working to reduce Chinese investment in key industries, saying they want to de-risk. But cutting Chinese investment means losing access to Chinese expertise and markets, something Europe needs, especially during a time of economic trouble. So why is Italy doing it? Because they're afraid of how the US will react. Look at Pirelli, the tire company. A Chinese company owns over a third of it. You'd think that's good for exports to China. But they're having problems in the US, like supplying Formula One teams, because of restrictions tied to national security. Again, it's all about Chinese ownership. The US sees that as a threat. It's gotten to the point where if anything has a Chinese investor, it's automatically treated like a problem. And the same thing is happening in the energy sector. Italian energy companies can't take on US projects either, just because of their Chinese connections. Even with the US cutting funding and raising tariffs, Europe can't walk away. They're stuck. And it's not just China. Europe is also still caught up in the Russia situation. The EU is about to introduce a 19th round of sanctions on Russia. But is it helping? Or is it just making things worse for Europe? If you look at Russia's finances, they're still doing okay. Oil money may slow down, but other industries are growing, helped by countries like China and India. Meanwhile, Europe cut itself off from cheap Russian energy and is spending billions with no clear gain. They're losing influence in the world while the US takes the lead. Europe isn't even involved in key international talks like the Alaska Summit. Their economy is being sacrificed, and for what? Since 2022, German exports to China have dropped hard. Chinese companies are making their own auto parts and machinery now, and Europe's stuff is more expensive and not necessarily better. Germany and other countries are stuck. China doesn't need their exports, but Europe still needs Chinese components to keep costs low, and they also need to sell to the US. So they're trying to please both sides, and it's not working. The EU has lost leverage. Their trade deficit with China has doubled since 2020. Even with tariffs on Chinese goods, they're buying way more than they're selling. And when Russia got cut off, all those resources just went straight to China, not Europe. Now Europe wants to sell cars and aircraft parts to the US. Sounds good, right? But where are the raw materials coming from? Probably China. So even if they want to shift away from China, they can't. That's just how the modern supply chain works now. The pressure is building. The US is now telling Europe it's time to fully commit, support more sanctions, isolate Russia, and even go after China and India. That's a clear sign of who's in control. The US Treasury Secretary is basically calling the shots in Europe. It's awkward, it's humiliating, and it doesn't make much sense. But what can Europe really do? If they say no, Trump could respond by doubling tariffs on European products, which would destroy industries, especially car makers in Germany. So Europe is caught in the middle. No easy choices, just pressure from all sides. The United States is stepping up its pressure campaign, not just on rivals, but on its allies. It's making it clear that it wants Europe to join its effort to isolate and weaken BRICS, the powerful bloc led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding with more partners. The justification? Their continued purchase of Russian oil, despite the West's sanctions. But that's just the surface. The bigger goal is strategic. Limit BRICS' global economic influence by cutting off access to key markets, starting with Europe. The US wants Europe to impose heavy tariffs on BRICS economies, especially China and India, effectively boxing them out of the EU's consumer base. But here's the irony. Europe's economy isn't strong enough to play hardball. Consumers across the continent are already under stress. Wages are stagnating, inflation remains a concern, and energy prices are still volatile post-Ukraine. If the average American is struggling with rising debt, European consumers are even worse off. Their economies are showing signs of long-term fatigue. If they follow the US's plan, they risk tipping over entirely. And let's not forget who makes most of the goods Europe would now be cutting off. China and India are deeply embedded in Europe's supply chains. Everything from chemicals to electronics to pharmaceuticals involves inputs from BRICS countries. If Europe wants to punish BRICS by severing trade, it will have to find replacements for critical raw materials and manufactured components. That's no small task, and the cost would be enormous. To make matters worse, Europe is far more economically entangled with BRICS than the US is. Over 23% of the EU's trade is with BRICS plus countries, compared to just 16.7% for the US. That's a significant difference, and it shows how much Europe stands to lose if this trade relationship breaks down. In contrast, BRICS nations are more diversified. Less than 15% of their trade depends on Europe, and under 10% is tied to the US. They've been steadily building ties with Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, the so-called Global South, giving them options. So the equation is simple. Europe needs BRICS more than BRICS needs Europe. And that's why this strategy is dangerous. If the US and EU push ahead with sanctions and trade barriers, BRICS will certainly retaliate. That could mean higher tariffs on European goods, export restrictions, or redirection of supply chains to friendlier markets. The end result? Europe gets hit with rising input costs, fewer buyers for its exports, and shrinking economic growth. It would be like pulling bricks out of a wall that holds up your own house. Collapse is inevitable. This isn't fear-mongering. It's basic economics. Europe exported nearly $450 billion in goods to BRICS countries last year. In return, it imported about $750 billion worth of goods, a massive amount of trade. But more importantly, these imports aren't luxury items. They're essentials, rare earth elements, raw materials, intermediate goods, energy supplies. If those flows are disrupted, Europe can't simply switch suppliers overnight, especially not at the same price. And domestic production? It's nowhere near ready to fill the gap. This is why many analysts are warning that if Europe follows the US down this path, it won't just hurt its economy. It could lock the continent into a deeper dependency on American industry and financial support. That's a far cry from the EU's goal of strategic autonomy. Instead of becoming more independent, Europe would become more reliant on a partner that is increasingly focused on its own interests. Meanwhile, the US is also escalating another front in this global reshaping, the chip war. Donald Trump, already a major figure in this strategy, is promising to push tariffs on imported semiconductors from 100% to 300%. That's not a typo. A 300% tariff would make foreign-made chips 3 times as expensive for US buyers. The reason? The US wants to dominate the global chip supply chain. Not just the design, but the actual manufacturing and equipment. Trump's goal is to move chip production from Asia to American soil. That includes giants like TSMC, Taiwan, Samsung and SK Hynix, South Korea, and even equipment makers like ASML, Netherlands, and Tokyo Electron, Japan. But instead of building up new US-based competitors, which would take years and billions of dollars, the idea is to relocate existing global leaders into the US. The means? Aggressive tariffs, political pressure, and a wave of subsidies. All funded by deficit spending and dollar printing. Here's where it gets tricky. If chip makers don't move, US consumers and businesses will still need their products, especially the advanced chips that only TSMC can currently make at scale. That means Americans would end up paying the tariffs. Prices would spike. Electronics would become more expensive. Businesses that rely on cutting-edge chips, AI startups, defense contractors, biotech firms, would face higher costs and supply constraints. If the companies do agree to relocate to the US, problems still remain. Building new fabrication plants, fabs, takes years. Operating them at full capacity takes even longer. And they won't necessarily be cheaper. Labor, materials, and regulations in the US make chip production significantly more expensive than in Taiwan or South Korea. So even with domestic chips, costs will rise, and efficiency will likely drop. It's not a guaranteed win. China, of course, will respond too. It already controls much of the global supply of rare earth materials, essential for chip making. If it cuts exports or imposes restrictions, that could choke US chip production before it even scales up. And China isn't sitting still. Its R&D spending on chips is growing fast, up 20% last year alone. Over the past 15 years, China's total R&D spending has multiplied 5-fold. It's closing the gap with the US, and it's already starting to produce viable alternatives to Western chips. So here we are. The US wants to reshape global trade and dominate key industries, but it lacks the natural resources, industrial depth, and time to do it smoothly. Europe is being asked to support this effort, even though the consequences for its own economy could be devastating. And if both go too far, they could end up isolating themselves from the very global markets they once led. This isn't just about trade, it's about how the world is changing. The old rules of globalization are being rewritten. Alliances are shifting. Power is moving east and south. The US and EU have a choice. Adapt to the new reality, or try to fight it with walls, tariffs, and pressure. But if they choose the latter, they risk building those walls around themselves.